This is Latin America, easily the most Christian region on Earth. It's home to 37% of the world's Christians, and within the region itself, 86% of people identify as Christian. Yet, travel north into the US and Canada, and that number drops to just 64% and 53% respectively. But why is this the case? Why is Latin America still so religious? I mean, even Spain and Portugal, the two colonizing countries who literally forced Christianity onto them, aren't as religious anymore. Well, to understand this religious flip-flop, we have to go all the way back to the 1500s. Because for many European powers at the time, religion wasn't just about spreading the word of God. It was rather about control. And the colonization of Latin America was no different. The Catholic Church was part of the very structure of these empires, and it shaped how the colonies were governed, taxed, educated, and even built. If you were to walk down virtually any city in Latin America, you'd see they all have a familiar layout. A central plaza, a cathedral facing the square, and government buildings nearby. That was for a reason. In 1573, Spain's laws of the Indies laid out exactly how colonial towns were supposed to be built, right down to the placement of the church and the orientation of the altar, known as La Traza. This layout tells you everything about how religion functioned in Latin America from the very beginning. It wasn't just preached to the masses, but built into the blueprint of society. When Spain and Portugal first set foot in the Americas, they didn't only bring missionaries. They established a system where the church and empire worked side by side, giving the Catholic Church enormous power over colonial society. In 1508, Pope Julius II formally granted the monarchs perpetual patronage over the Catholic Church in all American territories. Any communication between Rome and the colonial church had to pass through the Crown's Council of the Indies. In Spain, it was called the Patronato Real, and in Portugal, the Padroado. So the point I'm trying to make is that Catholicism wasn't a faith people chose to follow, but rather the legal infrastructure of being a colonial subject. This is where Catholicism became embedded in the governing structure of colonial life. From the moment you were born to the moment you were buried, the church controlled almost every aspect of social existence. It ran schools and hospitals, recorded marriages, baptisms, and even became the largest landowner in the colonies. In Mexico alone, roughly 5 million indigenous people were baptized between 1524 and 1536. These were mass baptisms that prioritized speed over doctrinal understanding. Priests would sprinkle water, give a Christian name, and move on. Churches were built directly atop destroyed indigenous temples, using the very stones of dismantled pyramids. And by 1610, the Spanish Inquisition had been established in Lima, Mexico City, and Cartagena, yet reached across Spanish America, making Catholic orthodoxy part of colonial law. There wasn't any real alternative for over 2 centuries. But here's the thing, what actually happened on the ground was syncretism, where indigenous and African religious practices didn't disappear, but got blended into Catholic structure. The most famous example is the Virgin of Guadalupe, who's said to have appeared in 1531 at Tepeyac Hill in Mexico, the site of a former Aztec shrine to the mother goddess Tonantzin. She appeared as a dark-skinned indigenous woman using Nahua religious symbols. Catholics saw the Virgin Mary, while indigenous Mexicans saw Tonantzin. In Brazil, enslaved Africans mapped Yoruba orishas, or spiritual deities, onto Catholic saints, creating hybrid religions like Candomblé and Umbanda. Andean festivals merged with Catholic feast days. Dia de los Muertos folded pre-Hispanic ancestral rites into All Souls Day. This is where Catholicism stopped feeling foreign and became the language ordinary people used for identity. But this happened alongside one of the greatest demographic collapses in human history. European diseases killed up to 90% of the indigenous population across the Americas within a few generations, going from 56 million in 1492 to 5.6 million by 1600. What happened wasn't just a humanitarian tragedy. It was also an event that wiped out pre-colonial religious life. By the end of it, Catholicism wasn't even competing with indigenous spirituality, because in many places it was the only framework left standing. Meanwhile, way up north in regards to the British settlers, religion developed very differently. Not because they were less religious, as they definitely weren't, but because their relationship to religion was more fragmented from the start. Many of the people coming were religious refugees fleeing constant Catholic-Protestant wars that had torn Europe apart, bringing different versions of Christianity with them. This pluralism arrived with the boats, meaning no single denomination could truly dominate beyond their own regions. And in 1791, the First Amendment to the US Constitution formally disestablished religion at the federal level, making the US the first country in modern history with a constitutionally pluralistic religious market. This difference mattered enormously. By the time many Latin American countries gained independence in the early 1800s, you might expect those religious structures of the colonial empires to have faded. But that didn't happen. In fact, they almost entirely remained in place. Most new republics kept Catholicism as the official state religion, and the church kept much of everything as a result, including its land, which in Mexico and Ecuador accounted for roughly half of the arable land by the early 1800s, and in Colombia was roughly a third of the land. The church was still the biggest landowner in much of Latin America at this time. But the 19th century also became the start of a long power struggle between liberals who wanted to break church influence and conservatives who wanted to preserve it. For example, Peru passed liberal reforms in 1856 that abolished tithes and suppressed convents. 3 years later, Mexico's La Reforma went even further under Benito Juárez, doing the same thing but also separating church authority from the state. Venezuela closed almost all religious establishments, plus so much more in 1873, and Argentina broke off diplomatic relations with the Vatican in 1884. These are just a few examples. Versions of this struggle played out across the region everywhere. Mexico's 1917 constitution ultimately went further than any in the region, banning religious orders from teaching and stripping clergy of voting rights, which provoked the Cristero War, an armed Catholic uprising from 1926 to 1929 that killed roughly 90,000 people. By 1934, only 334 priests were licensed to serve 15 million Mexicans. A year later, 17 states had no priests at all. The church was dismantled like it was a virus. Which makes sense, but what doesn't make sense is that you might be dealing with tons of viruses and not doing anything about it. That's why I'd like to introduce the sponsor of this video, NordVPN, an all-in-one digital security leading powerhouse. Let me explain. See, NordVPN is already the world's leading VPN provider. That's not going anywhere. But they also have a next-gen antivirus. See, while many traditional antiviruses won't act until the malicious file is already on your device, NordVPN seeks to intercept threats at the source, blocking malware, fake shops, and scam websites from ever appearing to you. It's never been simpler to be safer with just one solution. And there's 24/7 customer support if you need help with any of it. So go to nordvpn.com/versed to get an exclusive NordVPN deal plus 4 months extra. It's risk-free with NordVPN's 30-day money-back guarantee. Anyways, even with this church purging, those radical measures couldn't undo 400 years of institutional and cultural religious authority. Though the Catholic Church did lose ground in everyday life. In vast rural areas and fast-growing urban peripheries, parish coverage became even thinner. And that gap is what allowed the first competitor to Catholicism to finally slip in. Brazil was the opening. In 1910, Luigi Francescon, an Italian immigrant living in Chicago and involved in the early Pentecostal movement, traveled to Brazil, where he established the Christian Congregation in Brazil among Italian immigrant communities in São Paulo and Paraná. A year later, in 1911, 2 Swedish Pentecostal missionaries, Daniel Berg and Gunnar Wingren, arrived in Belém in northern Brazil and founded what would become the Assemblies of God. Growth was slow at first, but by 1965, Pentecostals in Brazil grew from 100,000 to over 3 million. So if Latin America was becoming more religiously plural, why didn't that pluralism lead to a religious decline, like in the US? Well, one of the clearest findings in global social science is the correlation between economic insecurity and religious intensity. The poorest countries on Earth are usually among the most religious, while the wealthiest are the opposite. There are some exceptions, of course, but the broad pattern holds. Now, much of Latin America unfortunately fits this pattern. Across the region, many countries live with deep inequality, economic instability, violence, and low trust in government. In that environment, religion can offer something stable. It provides moral order, community, hope, and ways to make sense of suffering. Religion survives best where it's useful, and in Latin America, religion has remained extremely useful, even socially. If your neighborhood has no reliable state services and no strong civic institutions, the local church may be the only institution that knows your name. But even with all this being said, by the mid-20th century, the Catholic Church started to see cracks forming in its old top-down monopoly of hierarchy, tradition, and state power. So came the Second Vatican Council. Between 1962 and 1965, the Catholic Church launched its most sweeping internal reform in centuries, opening the door to a more modern, socially engaged church. In 1968, Latin American bishops met in Medellin, Colombia, and declared a preferential option for the poor. As a result, liberation theology was born, a fusion of Catholic doctrine and structural critique of poverty due to unjust economic systems. From the late 1960s through the 1980s, it dominated the intellectual conversation inside Latin America. But here's the thing. Liberation theology was really a movement of priests and intellectuals, not of the masses. Even at the height of their membership in the late 1970s and early 1980s, Brazil's base ecclesial communities, which practiced it, reached an estimated 2.5 million members across 70,000 local groups. That might sound like a huge number until you remember Brazil had a population of around 120 million people at the time. They were small parish-level groups organized around Bible study and social action. The actual poor, the people whose cause had supposedly been championed, were quietly converting to something else. As the saying goes, the priests of liberation opted for the poor, but the poor themselves opted for Pentecostalism. Pentecostalism grew because it reached people where institutions often failed to. It worked from the ground up, while Catholicism had long worked from the top down. And to really see why that made a difference, you have to start locally. The first reason was access. Anyone with a calling could plant a Pentecostal church. No seminary, no bishop, no 7-year ordination pipeline. A storefront, microphone, and message were enough. The second was that Pentecostal churches spoke to immediate personal problems like addiction, marital crisis, and financial breakdown. They addressed in the language of direct spiritual intervention rather than structural critique. The third was geography. As I said before, Pentecostal churches followed migrants into the favelas and urban peripheries, where Catholic parishes were stretched too thin, unable to. Then there's the gender dimension. Many scholars argue Pentecostalism appealed to Latin American women because it disciplined male behavior, especially infidelity and drinking, in ways that made household life more stable, while Catholic festivals often had drinking and required expensive sponsorships. The controversial prosperity gospel, the teaching that faith produces material blessing, matched the lived ambition of people climbing from rural poverty into unstable urban jobs. But here's the thing, for many of its followers, prosperity didn't mean wealth. It meant survival, and part of that was spiritually. In Pew's 2014 Latin America survey, which is unfortunately the most recent we have, 81% of former Catholics who became Protestant cited the search for a personal connection to God. It all seemingly worked. In 1910, 94% of Latin Americans were Catholic, and just 1% Protestant. By 2014, that had shifted to 69% Catholic and 19% Protestant. Brazil went from having 864 evangelical church buildings in 1970 to nearly 110,000 by the late 2010s. Lastly, there's the political control that religion can bring. Guatemala saw it early, when General Efraín Ríos Montt, who came to power by military coup in 1982, leaned on his evangelical identity to claim political legitimacy, becoming the first evangelical head of state in Latin American history. In Brazil, the Evangelical Parliamentary Front became one of the most powerful blocs in Congress. Edir Macedo, founder of the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God in 1977, bought Record TV in 1989, now Brazil's second most watched station, and spreads its message. Jair Bolsonaro's 2018 presidential victory and extremely loyal supporter base were driven heavily by evangelical mobilization. These weren't just churches anymore, they were media empires and political machines. The Catholic Church has continued to be Brazil's largest religious institution, but its monopoly is still shrinking. The number of Catholics fell from 65.1% of the population in 2010 to 56.7% in 2022. Meanwhile, the evangelical share rose from 21.6% to 26.9%, adding 12 million more followers. This is what's called religious switching. Unlike secularization, it's not the decline of religion. The total religious population has barely moved. This didn't really happen in the US or Canada. In fact, they were going through even stronger secularizing forces. The first was mass higher education. The US went from 7.7% of young adults with a college degree in 1960 to nearly 40% by 2020. And higher education is one of the most consistent predictors of religious decline. The second was women entering the workforce en masse. American women's labor force participation roughly doubled between 1950 and 2000, and religious institutions had relied heavily on women's volunteer time and the intergenerational transmission of faith. The third was technology. The birth of the internet was massive. People began being able to communicate more outside of their local bubbles. You suddenly were provided vast, decentralized knowledge and alternative perspectives to everything, which challenges the historic role of religion as the gatekeepers of many questions. Latin America had much weaker versions of all of these, besides the internet part, of course. The easiest way to put it is this. In North America, modernization often replaced the church. In Latin America, modernization often moved people from one kind of church to another. Now, that doesn't mean the religiously unaffiliated or even atheism isn't growing across the region. For example, Uruguay has been a long-time outlier and one of the region's wealthiest countries per capita, with almost 50% unaffiliated. Chile has reached roughly 33%. And among the 6 Latin American countries I mentioned earlier, Catholic affiliation dropped by at least 9 percentage points since 2014. There are now more unaffiliated adults than Protestants in Argentina, Chile, Colombia, and Mexico. But when you zoom out to the broader global picture, this looks nothing like European or American secularization. In fact, a person in Latin America who says they have no religion is often about as religious in belief and practice as a Christian in Europe. 92% of Brazil's religiously unaffiliated still believe in God. In Colombia, 47% of people with no religion pray daily, a rate that exceeds daily prayer among Christians in any European country surveyed. In Peru, even unaffiliated people will say religion is still very important in their lives, more than Christians in almost every European country. In fact, this is called fragmented secularization. It's when affiliation and attendance fall, but the belief in religion stays high. So the point I'm trying to make is, while Latin Americans are leaving churches, they aren't leaving the faith. The monopoly may be breaking, but the culture didn't. That's why Latin America is still so religious. Thank you for watching. And thanks again to NordVPN for sponsoring this video. Don't forget to click the link in the bio to get an exclusive NordVPN deal plus 4 months extra. I'll see you in the next one.